Hey friends, welcome to our first official True Crime Quilt Guild how-to session. So today, if you want to take a look at your pattern, I'm on page 4 and we are going to make 4 patch squares. 4 patch squares are the stepping stone for an awful lot of other quilt patterns. So that's where we're going to start today. So I want to talk a little bit about how you prep your fabric before you cut it. Now, if this is a quilt that you expect that you're going to wash frequently, then you probably want to pre-wash your fabric so that it is pre-shrunk, and so you'll just need to pre-wash it and then press it, and then you'll be ready to get started. What I have here is a yard of fabric. You probably won't need a whole yard. You may have bought what are called fat quarters, which are 1/4 of a yard, but they're cut a different way than you would expect. So the length of the width of the fabric usually is how you would cut a 1/4 yard. But in this case, you cut your 1/4 yard this way instead. So regardless of how much fabric you have, you want to take a look. These white edges are the selvages. That's where the fabric attaches to the machine when it's being woven. And they are a different texture and they are a different stretch strength than the rest of the fabric. So it's a good idea to cut those off because you don't want those involved in your fabric. In your quilt. So now we usually, and you want to cut the selvages off on both sides. You can see on the other side, it's not white, but it still has that woven feel to it. Now in quilting, we often cut more than one layer at a time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to square up those selvages and I'm going to cut them off. The easiest way to do that is to go ahead and fold the fabric. Now you want to make sure that you haven't got any wrinkles or odd folds underneath so that it's all laying flat. And then what we'll do is we'll just trim those selvages off. Now, the next thing we need to talk about is rulers and rotary cutters. So my fabric's not quite laying flat. If your fabric's not laying flat, you may want to press it before you continue just to make sure that you're cutting accurately. So when we cut fabric, we're always going to have the portion that we're measuring to the left. So in this case, I'm going to use my long ruler. I'm going to use my rotary cutter that has a new fresh blade in it. I try and put a fresh blade in anytime I start a new project, because you are going to be cutting through multiple thicknesses of fabric. You certainly want to have a sharp blade if you're doing that. So now the easiest thing to do is to line up the fabric edge on a line on your mat board. Now, we don't really use this mat board for measuring a lot, but it's good to have it lined up so you've got a straight line. And I'm going to take that selvage edge off. So I'm just going to line up my, if you look here, I'm going to take about a 1/2 inch off. So I'm going to line up that 1/2 inch line all the way down on my board. I'm going to line the line on my ruler up with the line on my board so that I know I have a straight line. And then I'm going to take my rotary cutter. I'm going to go right, press down and go right through all of those layers. Now, before I let this go, let's pull this aside just to make sure that we have a clean cut there. And we do. So this goes in the scrap bag. And now we're actually ready to cut some of our 4-patch squares. So the way that this works is we're going to cut some long strips of fabric. We're going to sew them together, and then we're going to cut them and reposition them. So let's start out by cutting that first strip. Now we know, according to our pattern, that we need to cut the strips into 2.5-inch sections. So once again, I'm going to line my fabric up on a line so that I know I'm getting a straight cut. I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to move it to the 2.5-inch mark. So 1, 2.5. Now I'm going to line up that 1/2 inch where I want to cut all the way down so it's lined up top and bottom. And I'm going to hold this firmly, but I'm not going to get my fingers too close to this edge because this little guy is a razor blade and I do not want to take the tips of my fingers off. And I have known people who have done that. So we're going to cut this strip from bottom to top or top to bottom, whichever you are most comfortable with. And now we're going to pull this to make sure we have a clean cut. Now, I just replaced the blade in my rotary cutter, and I tightened this tightening screw up a little too much. So my blade wasn't turning very freely. So I've just loosened that up a little bit. So that's just a little tip. So now we have this 2.5-inch strip. Now, what makes this 4-patch interesting is that we have 2 colors that are one dark and one light. Now, if you are making a quilt, yes, you can see my puppy in the background. If you are making a quilt that has different colors, you'll need to take a look at the pattern on the front. And we eventually are going to be doing the center square that has that 9-patch in it. And so you can see this center square. So we're also going to be doing these little units for cornerstones amid the sashing. So if you are doing a quilt that has different colors in it rather than I'm doing black and white, so it's just a matter of the intensity, dark to light. But if you are doing a quilt that has color in it, you probably want to use 2 of a light and a dark in whatever colors you pulled out from your focus fabric. Okay, so we've got a dark strip. And now we're going to do the same thing with the light. The first thing we're going to do is square up our fabric. So we're going to take that selvage edge off so that we know we have a straight line, a straight edge that we can measure from. So we're going to start out by making sure we're matching our corners so everything is together as it should be. And then we're going to trim that selvage edge. So just kind of shake it out, make sure it's nice and straight so we can trim that selvage edge. Hello, Miss Bindi. So once again, we're going to line it up on a line here. And we're going to take about a 1/2 inch off. So we've got fabric lined up on the line. We're going to go to that 1/2 inch mark on our ruler, line it up with the line on the mat below, and then we're just going to go right through there. Pull this away to make sure that we don't have anything that we've missed cutting. And that goes in the rag bag, or in the scrap bag. And once again, we're going to cut 2.5, just like we did on the other one. So we're lining it up on a line, making sure it's nice and straight. Lining up our ruler on the 1 2.5 inch mark. And then we're going to slice that one as well. Now we have these 2 pieces of fabric that we need to sew together. So now we're going to talk about sewing at the machine. So as I talked about in my last video, the most important thing we need your sewing machine to do is sew a straight 1/4 inch seam. Most quilters use plain white cotton thread. We use cotton fabric and we use plain white cotton thread. If you are stitching on something that looks better with gray thread, you may use gray instead. Most quilters do not match the thread to the quilt because you don't see the thread on the inside of the quilt. Once the quilt is finished, the thread that holds the blocks together is not visible. So we quilt with colored thread, but we don't necessarily sew the blocks together with quilted thread. So plain white cotton thread is best. I buy it on these big old spools. My sewing machine is a Janome. It's about 20 years old, and it has a lot of fancy stitches on it. It can do some embroidery work. It can do some a few letters and numbers for labels. I don't know if you can see that or not, but it's not, those stitches are not necessary. They're fun to have if you're doing a particular kind of quilting, but they're not necessary for what we're doing, which is just constructing blocks. So the next thing that we want to do is we want to put our fabric together. Step around this way. So we're going to end up with 2 long pieces of fabric. And from that, we're going to make our squares, our intermediate squares. The way we start is with 2 strips of fabric, and they need to be sewn together face to face. So print side to print side, right sides together, as they say. So that's how it looks when we start. Now, if you feel more comfortable dropping a pin in every so often, just to hold those 2 pieces securely, you can do that. Pin as far away as possible from where you're going to be sewing. That way you won't have to pull pins when you start sewing. I know lots of people sew over pins. I don't like to do that. I think it's hard on your sewing machine needle. My sewing machine gets pretty temperamental when you go over pins. It often causes the thread to break. So I try and avoid sewing over pins if I don't absolutely have to. If I'm not in a situation where I've got many pieces coming together at a point where not sewing over the pin is going to cause everything to come loose and slip. So now my fabric's got a little bit of a wrinkle in it. That's going to press out as it goes underneath the presser foot, but you can always run an iron over that and press out any of those wrinkles and crinkles. Now, we talked a little bit before about 1/4 inch seams. Everything in quilting is done on a 1/4 inch seam, so that when this piece is cut and put together, those seam allowances will make a 2 inch block. So 1/4 inch on each side will mean that rather than 2.5 inch block, we'll have a 2 inch block. It's very important that your seams are consistent. So one of the things I've suggested, and suggested in my last video as well, is if you are new to this or you're unfamiliar with your sewing machine, I recommend taking a ruler, figuring out where your 1/4 inch seam is, at where your needle is, and then laying down a piece of painter's tape to give yourself a straight edge that you can sew along. If, like me, you've been sewing on the same machine for a long time, you know exactly where on the presser foot the 1/4 inch seam mark is. But if it's unfamiliar or you're not sure, just put a piece of painter's tape right there, a piece of blue tape that you can pull up later, and that'll give you a guide so that you can just guide the edge of your fabric right along that 1/4 inch line. Now we're going to sew these two guys together. So I have my fabric. It's been pinned periodically together, and I'm going to sew right along that opposite edge. Now, it's possible that this fabric is going to slip against one another as you go along. So I always recommend kind of taking it slow. You don't have to be a speed demon when you're sewing, so that you can see. We're going to pull our thread to the back. And now the other thing about sewing on a quilt is that you're going to be sewing every seam. You're going to be locking it with another seam because the square is going to come together. So I don't backstitch. Most quilters don't backstitch. So we're going to lift our foot. We're going to put this in just far enough for it to get a start at the 1/4 inch mark. And we're going to sew this seam. I know it may seem a little odd that I am standing up. I actually like to stand up to sew. Let's see if we can move that over so that it can be seen by the camera. So we're going to take a nice slow run. Now, my Janome has a 1/4 inch mark here, and I've been sewing on this machine long enough to know right where I line up the presser foot, the fabric with the presser foot, to know what a 1/4 inch seam is for this machine. But I can tell you that there was blue painter's tape on this for a long time. So we're just going to sew right along this edge. And then we're going to talk about how we press our seams. And voila. Okay, now we're going to remove our pins because we won't need those anymore. And next, we're going to talk about pressing, because pressing your seams flat and beautiful, as one of the guys from TikTok who used to be on Project Runway always says, he presses his seams flat and beautiful. A little tabletop ironing board comes in quite handy for these kinds of projects. And I recommend a good old steam iron. Now, a lot of quilters will use starch or fabric finish as they go along, and that's entirely up to you. If you have a fabric that feels like it's not cooperating, you may want to add a little bit of starch to it. Now, in general, the way that we press, there are two options. You can press this seam open as you would in garment sewing. So if you have been a garment sewer and you've always pressed your seams open, you can do that. And I guess my suggestion would be experiment and see which you like. I would say that there are some blocks where it makes sense to press the seams open. But the usual rule of thumb for quilting is to press the light fabric over the dark. So you're pressing to the dark, okay? Now there's a reason for this, because when you start alternating your blocks, you're going to be able to nest the seams easier, because your blocks are going to be alternated, so the nested seams will be easier to connect to one another, and I will show you that. So we're just going to press to the dark, and then what we're going to do is we're going to flip this over. We're going to make sure that that's a nice flat seam. We know that that seam is going to press, that seam is being pressed to the dark underneath, and we're just going to make sure that on the right side it's nice and flat. Okay? Now, the next thing is we need to make blocks out of this. Now, when I'm not filming, I guarantee that I'm not moving this stuff all around. I have it all sort of arrayed next to me, and I just kind of move from place to place, from ironing board to cutting mat and to sewing machine. But we need to do this in front of the camera. Now, just as we squared up our first fabric to make sure, I have a variety of cutting mats, cutting guides, whatever's handiest for you. I would recommend having a 12-inch square, because we're going to square up 12-inch blocks, and that's very helpful to have a 12-inch square. You can do it without, but it's easier with a full-size 12-inch square. This one is 10 inches, 9.5, I think. So whatever cutting guides are easiest for you. I do recommend having a long cutting guide. It doesn't have to be quite as long as this one, but at least the width of your mat, because I think it comes in handy when you are cutting large pieces. So this is a good one to have. So just as we squared up our first fabric and cut the selvages off. We're going to cut this uneven end off just to make sure that it is neat and tidy. So we're going to square up the bottom of the fabric, which we know is straight because we cut it straight. We're going to cut the bottom of the fabric, square up the bottom of the fabric, and then we're going to I generally would take off about a 1/2 inch. We've got plenty of fabric here. So one thing you need to know about quilting is that quilting is not necessarily fabric sparing. Quilting is about creating a design and not necessarily about being economical about fabric. So once again, we're going to hold this guide down. We're going to line the guide up with the guide on the mat. I'm going to take our rotary cutter and we're going to take that little piece off just to make sure that that is straight and square. Now, our pattern calls for us to cut this strip into 2.5 inch sections so that we will eventually end up with 2-inch squares. So once again, we're going to find the 2-inch mark on our guide, and we're going to line that up because we know that our fabric is already on a line. We're going to line that up, lined up on the bottom, lined up here, put the guide over the top, and then we're going to measure that 2 inches, and we're going to make sure that 2-inch mark is on our line so that it is straight and square. And we're going to cut. That's our first unit. So what we're going to do is continue to cut 2-inch units. Remember that center square in our quilt pattern is actually a 16 patch. But I want to start with a 4 patch just so that we understand we understand the idea. So please let me know in the comments if this is making sense, if I need to go over anything, if you're having trouble seeing what I'm doing. It's sort of an experiment with the camera to try and figure out how to the best way to illustrate this. So we're going to make a 4 patch, and the way we make a 4 patch is that we want to go opposite like so. So now we need to sew these 2 units together in order to make this 4 patch. And the way that we do this is we put right sides together, and then remember how we nested those, how we pressed those seams so they will nest together. Now what I want you to see is how we have, hopefully I can get my camera to focus, that we have butted those seams up against one another, the dark and the light. Can you see that? once you push those seams against one another, then you want to take a pin and run the pin right down the stitching on one side. If you have it lined up properly, the pin should come out on the stitching on this side. Mine's off, so I'm going to repin it. It takes a little practice, and it takes being able to feel the folds lining up against one another. When those two seams line up, then your square, the corners of your square are going to line up. That's better. So now we're going to stitch along that line. Once again, we're just going to put it into the machine, right to where it's going to catch the needle. We're going to take a nice, slow stitch. Now, when we get to the point where we're going to go over this seam, we're going to take it kind of slow. We're going to make sure that we feed that under the foot so that it's pinned down, it's tacked down. We're going to pull the pin. And there we have our 4-patch. Now again, now we have a 4-patch. How do we press to the dark? Well, we're going to try and press opposite of our last seam, because that's what's going to make it lay nice and flat. So it isn't quite pressing to the dark because we have a light and a dark on each side, but we're going to press that seam opposite so that it lays nice and flat. So we start on the reverse, on the wrong side. And now the right side. A little steam helps set those seams. And there we have our first 4-patch. These are going to be the cornerstones in the quilt, in the sashing. Now, I'm not sure I'm going to use these as a cornerstone because I'm thinking I might want to put a little pop of color into my cornerstones. But now we know how to make these 4 patches. It's exactly the same process, except that we're going to put 16 of them together. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to add these, and then we're going to add another row. So the first thing we're going to do is sew these together so that we have 4 this way and then 4 this way. So we're going to sew these together. You can sew them in units like we did the first one, and then sew that unit to the next unit, or you can just sew each one on. Doesn't matter either way. When you're done, you will have all of these connected, and you will have another one that looks just like this, and you will sew that one, those 2 together to make that 16 patch. And that is the center of your quilt. That is the very middle with the star in the middle. Please let me know if you have questions below, or if if you're having trouble understanding this, or it's tough with the camera, and I will do my best to adjust some things, and hopefully each one will get technically a little bit better. So our next square that we're going to work on in the next video is going to be how to make flying geese. Flying geese is a triangle, and we're going to learn how to make those triangle shaped squares, because you will see that triangle shapes make up many different quilts. So for those of you who've been following along, my daughter asked me to make her a quilt at Christmas, and it wasn't quite finished by the time Christmas rolled around, but here it is finished. And as you can see, these triangles here and here, those are all called flying geese. And they're quite a basic block that we end up with just about any time we're making quilt blocks with points or stars. So the next thing we're going to learn how to do is do flying geese. And I just thought I'd do a little show and tell, since that's all finished. I'm waiting for some backing I ordered to come in so that I can get that one finished up and off to her. Tune in next time, because we're going to learn how to make flying geese, and by that time we'll have these finished. We'll have the 16 patch and the 4 patch blocks that are going to work into our cornerstones finished, and then we'll set those aside. I'll see you next time on True Crime Quilt Guild. Don't forget, there are additional instructions that are linked in our show notes.